I'm Liz Harrison. I'm the Global Head of IVD at BSI. So I'm responsible for technical documentation and certificate decision-making operations. So notified bodies are structured in different ways, but in BSI we have separate groups of QMS assessors who do on-site QMS assessment and technical documentation reviewers. So I head up the technical documentation reviewing team, and also we issue all of the IVDR certificates. I've got some slides later on capacity, turnaround times, things like that, so please feel free to ask me any questions at the end. So I'm going to talk about practical implementation of Class Ds without EU reference labs. I think it's fair to say that when we got designated at BSI, we got designated with procedures and processes written under the assumption that EU reference labs would exist, certainly by the time of date of application, so this time last year. But we are where we are right now, and the Commission are quite keen that notified bodies issue Class D certificates, given May 2025 is only getting closer. So working together with the notified body working group that Marta's just presented on, we've been moving forward in how to issue these certificates without reference labs. So at the forefront of notified bodies and hopefully everybody's minds when we talk about Class Ds is that they're high-risk IVDs. They have a high public health risk and or a high personal risk. Most of the Class D IVDs were needed a notified body under the directive. And it's important to remember that the IVD directive List A of Annex 2 was written after the contaminated and infected blood scandals of the 1970s and 1980s. There's a lot of patients still living with the ramifications of receiving contaminated blood today, and also a lot of those patients have died because of the contaminated blood that they received. So it's devices under the IVDD that detect and screen for HIV 1 and 2, hepatitis B, C and D, and HGLV 1 and 2. Most IVDD notified bodies use the Paul Ehrlich Institute to assess the performance and then to release batches to market once they were certified. And it's a requirement that notified bodies release every batch of these devices. So under the IVDR, Rule 1 expands the highest risk devices to include all transmissible agents in blood components, cells, tissues and organs, transmissible agents that cause a life-threatening disease with a high or suspected high risk of propagation, so pandemic viruses essentially, and devices for determining infectious load of a life-threatening disease where monitoring is critical. And then Rule 2 includes the same blood grouping markers as IVDD, so your ABO blood grouping devices, plus Duffy and Kid System devices that are under IVDD Annex 2 List B. They're now up-classified to Class D under the regulation. So we're talking about stuff, if anybody ever needs a blood transfusion, which is quite regularly, these devices are really critical in ensuring that that blood product is safe to receive. So this infographic shows proportionally, so out of all of our Class D applications at BSI, this shows you the analyte. So it's relative percentages, it's not the full numbers that we have. So you can see 17% of our devices in application are blood grouping. Actually, this is application pipeline and certificates that we've already issued. Then a small number of HIV, hepatitis C, hepatitis B, multi-analyte blood screening, 1T pallidum, and then 42% of our applications for Class D are SARS-CoV-2 devices. And I'll talk about classification in my next slide. So why I didn't speak up in the last session, I didn't want to steal my slides' thunder. And then we also have 15% currently with no common specification. So the multi-analyte devices are typically HIV, hepatitis B, hepatitis C screening devices, and no common specification devices are a mixture of analytes, tropical viruses, dengue, Zika, chikungunya, various viruses that I hadn't even heard of before the Class D applications started rolling in. And it's fair to say that our manufacturers who are transitioning to Class D, most of them were our customers under the IVDD. They're really savvy, really used to interacting with the notified body, and they're well in good timelines for transitioning by May 2025, all with the exception of the manufacturers with SARS-CoV-2 devices. So 42% of my Class D pipeline, and bear in mind I'm an operational manager, so I'm recruiting people with certain technical competencies to review these devices. 42% of these devices, and the manufacturers, they're getting applications with the notified body, but then they're pushing back submission dates, pushing back and back and back, and waiting to see what happens with classification. But also these manufacturers aren't used to interacting with the notified body, so they're very naive. They have challenging times with QMS audits, and I think they're struggling to put their technical documentation together. And certainly, it's completely appropriate for these manufacturers that clinical samples are really hard to come by right now, because most people are vaccinated. The pandemic, it's exited that emergency phase. So to talk about the classification of these devices. So they're classified as Class D under Rule 1. They're also listed as an example in the MDCG 2020-16 Rev 2. So that's the classification guidance document. And as Marta said, at the moment, notified bodies are still regarding them as Class D. Despite the guidance, it is only guidance, it's not legally binding. So I believe that the Commission is consulting with competent authorities on what we all think that the classification of these devices should be. But it's also really important to remember that classification is the responsibility of the legal manufacturer of the device. And then it's the notified body's role to agree or disagree. And if we disagree, then the regulation and all of our designation procedures allow for classification review. After notified body classification review, if we still disagree on the classification, then we can elevate to classification dispute. So the dispute process is the notified body forwards their classification review outcome to the competent authority where the legal manufacturer is based or where their authorised representative is based. And so if anyone's got Class D SARS-CoV-2 devices in the pipeline and wants to initiate classification dispute, you're more than welcome to. I think if the competent authorities receive a lot of disputes, they might make their decision faster. And personally, as an operational manager, if that 42% of devices is not going to be Class D, I really need to know as soon as possible so that we can plan our technical documentation review pipeline. We do have manufacturers undertaking classification dispute at the moment for these devices. So a reminder of Class D EU reference lab requirements. So IVDR Article 100 outlines what the EU reference labs are supposed to do when they do exist. And from a conformity assessment perspective, what our organisation is doing is looking primarily at points 2A and 2B. So 2A is the requirement of the reference lab to verify the performance claimed and the compliance of those devices to an applicable common specification. And 2B is the requirement to carry out appropriate tests on samples of the manufactured Class D batches. So 2A happens during initial conformity assessment and 2B happens post-certification when manufacturers want to release batches to the market. No surprise, no EU reference labs designated today, which is a real challenge. And I think I speak for the other notified bodies that use Paul Ehrlich Institute under the directive. We would really prefer that reference labs existed. Taking away that independent verification of high-risk devices is actually quite a big deal for us as organisations in terms of the level of risk that we are then accepting. So we would much prefer that these labs are designated sooner rather than later. But as we said earlier, the Commission want to see Class D certificates issued. Legal manufacturers want to see Class D certificates issued. You've got to do all of your international registrations on the basis of your IVDR certificate, and time really is of the essence. So MDCG 2021-4 is the application of transitional provisions for Class D. So this was published in June 2021 and was intended to clear up, an impasse between notified bodies and the Commission, where we were waiting for reference labs and they were saying, well, actually, there's no legal mandate to provide reference labs. The legal mandate is that once they exist, notified bodies have to use them. This basically says that Article 100 requirements should be dealt with by internal notified body processes. And as Marta already mentioned, Team MB have published guidance on what we think we can do in the absence of these labs. All of the notified bodies are taking a risk-based approach now for issuing Class D certificates and for Class D conformity assessment. So the manufacturer really needs to be prepared to satisfy us that the design and manufacture of their device meets all applicable requirements. We're taking a big step without the reference laboratories, so manufacturers should be really aware that for notified bodies this is a high-risk activity and the onus is on the manufacturer to really present a lot of clear, robust data for the conformity assessment process. So for Article 100 2A, notified bodies will verify the performance claimed and compliance to the common specification during initial conformity assessment and, of course, any significant changes that come afterwards. We're already reviewing Class D significant changes for the Class D certificates that we've issued. So the different case-by-case examples that manufacturers are implementing, will do we might do a deeper dive during technical documentation review. We may send samples, we may do witness testing, and there are also other things that we're looking in the Notified Body Class D working group to implement. So then the notified bodies are defining the batch release testing requirements during initial conformity assessment. And again, this can include sending samples, using an independent test lab. There currently isn't one, but we're working together to try to source independent testing laboratories. Again, witness testing, deeper dives of documentation review, and others. Anything that we might think of during conformity assessment that reduces that risk to patients. So we're also taking, different devices present different types of risk. They may all be Class D, but there's a scale of risk within Class D and a scale of risk within organisations. So lower risk factors are if the notified body has a documented compliance history for similar or the same devices. So those legal manufacturers that are with a notified body for Annex 2 List A devices, if they're transitioning those same devices with the same notified body to Class D, they've got a head start because we know the devices. We may have a very long batch release history to know that those devices are safe and robust and that batch to batch they perform similarly. A well-documented post-market surveillance history helps. So if a manufacturer comes from a self-declared IVDD, but they've got a fantastic PMS records that they can show to us and show that the device has performed well on the market over time, then that again reduces that risk. Significant data meeting common specifications, low complexity devices, so many devices can just be controls, with an assigned value. They're much less complex than a diagnostic device or a screening devices. And then devices for diagnosing or viral load testing are less risky than devices that are for primary blood screening. This is not a list of rules. It's all case by case. It's all risk-based. It depends on, we tell our technical documentation reviewers, have a good look at the documentation, come out at the end of that technical documentation review with, a risk factor for this device and this legal manufacturer. Higher risk factors, novel device design or technology. So things that we may have never conceived of in the past. I don't think any notified body would be issuing certificates for those without a Class D reference lab. If the manufacturer's got a high number of non-conformities in their QMS history, so if that manufacturer shows they don't really have control of their QMS and their design and manufacturing process, poor or no post-market surveillance history, so new to market devices are more risky generally than legacy devices that have batch history. Virtual manufacturers who typically have less control over their device and less records to show that their device works as intended. Then if the intended purpose is for primary blood donation screening, and also self-tests. So HIV self-tests, SARS-CoV-2 self-test potentially, although on the risk scale, SARS-CoV-2 is now not as high as it was at the beginning of the pandemic. So everything comes into play. And notified bodies are implementing risk-based approach on a case-by-case basis. So the same device with a different manufacturer will be regarded as a different risk factor, depending on all of that history, all of the data, what the manufacturer puts in front of the notified body on the day. So it's really important to be prepared to be transparent and present as much design, manufacturing and on-market data as possible. BSI is requesting batch release market data for devices, the last 20 batches released to the market for legacy devices, and we're assessing how robust the performance of the devices are. If it's new to market, then we're doing a deeper dive. We'll do much more on-site witness testing before we would issue a Class D certificate. So common specifications help us to reduce the risk where they exist. So last year, the common specifications were finally published, and they're covering the devices detecting and or quantifying these analytes on the screen. So we've got all of the Annex 2 List A analytes, plus some of the additional analytes under Class D of the IVDR. And they're really helpful. They're really straightforward and sensible. They're also quite difficult to read. So what you need to do when you read the common specifications is work out which annex applies to your device, and then work out which table within that annex applies to your device. Once you've worked that out, they're actually really helpful for design and manufacture. They're also really helpful for notified bodies to review. We have a checklist, and it's a matter of tick, tick, tick. Does the manufacturer meet these requirements, or do they not? So the purpose and implementation of the common specifications. So at the beginning of the CS, it says for certain Class D in vitro diagnostic medical devices falling within scope of IVDR, standards do not exist, and there is a need to address public health concerns as the risk associated with the use of those devices is significant for public health and patient safety. Possibly that might be why we need an EU reference lab for these devices. It's therefore appropriate to adopt common specifications for these devices in respect of those requirements. So they're meant to help the manufacturer meet the requirements of the GSPR's Annex 1. The common specifications apply from the 25th of July 2024. So right now we're in the transition phase of them applying. And the legislation says that in the interim, applicable devices should comply with the common technical specifications or justify why not. So the common technical specifications cover the IVDD Annex 2 List A devices. So those devices, they really should be meeting the CTS because they've been published for a very long time. So until the 25th of July 2024, I've divvied up what the manufacturer's responsibility and what the notified body responsibility is during the transition time. So we suggest that manufacturers provide a checklist. We have our own checklist, so we give it to our legal manufacturers to ask them to fill in the applicable elements of the common specification and location of the solutions within the technical documentation. So for example, for HIV, you're meant to test 400 positive HIV-1 patients. So we ask for the precise location of where the data for those 400 patients is, and we make sure that it adds up to 400 as well. The manufacturer is responsible to justify any non-applicable elements because the common specifications are written for general devices. It doesn't always meet those specifics depending on the device design and manufacture and intended purpose. Not every element of the common specification is appropriate for every device. And then as we're in the transition phase, the manufacturers should justify the elements that are applicable but are not currently met. And that justification should be based on patient safety, not based on transitional provisions. So you can't just say, it doesn't apply yet, so we don't meet it. It's like, well, okay, why is this device safe to be on the market in that case? And then our responsibility is to check compliance against the applicable elements, agree with the justifications of non-applicability, and then agree with those safety justifications of the elements that are not in compliance yet due to the transitional provisions. And it's important to say that after the transition ends, certainly at BSI, we'd still take that approach. Not all of the requirements have to be met. It all depends on that patient safety justification and the device design and manufacture. So on to EU reference lab designation. When the Commission put out the call for designation, they split it into 8 scopes. And according to the EU Commission implementation rolling plan, the first designations are still due in Q3 this year. So we'll all wait and see how that turns out. And I believe that they have applications for every type of device except for the hemorrhagic fever and BSL-4 viruses, which I can imagine that as their BSL-4 viruses, having a lab that can handle them and also handle EU reference lab designation requirements would be really, really challenging. So I'm not surprised. I'm pleasantly surprised that they have applications for the other 7 areas of the scope. So assuming they reference labs do get designated, I think notified bodies will breathe a sigh of relief on the one hand that they're designated, but we're going to be interacting with a whole bunch of new organisations who are newly designated, who, apart from Paul Ehrlich Institute, have not done what they are going to be doing under the EU reference lab designation requirements. So designation is just going to be the start of it. Once they're designated, we need contracts between the notified body and the manufacturer. We're going to have to establish communication channels, who talks to who, when, via what mechanism. Legal manufacturers are going to need to get their instrumentation in. Blood screening instrumentation can be absolutely massive, and that needs to be installed, and the EU reference lab staff need to be trained. Then we have to, all of this has to be done, and I'm sure there's many other things that I've not thought about, before we can even get to the Article 100 2A performance verification requirements, and then onto batch release criteria. So there's going to be a really steep learning curve, and once they're ready to do this, the volumes are very significant. We've been sharing our expected volumes with the Commission and the reference labs. So a few comments on notified body capacity, because everyone always asks. So the other notified bodies have been talking about the increasing of staff, and as an operational manager since 2018, this is the percentage year-on-year increase, of new recruits that we've had of technical documentation reviewers at BSI. So between 2018 and 2022, we increased 225% FTE. The training, the harmonisation, making sure one reviewer, as Andrea said earlier, one reviewer interprets the requirements in one way and all of the other reviewers do it the same. It's really significant. The pool of regulatory IVD knowledge in the world is really small. We're a very, very niche group of individuals. So the training curve, the learning curve, it's long, it takes time. It's really should not be underestimated how difficult it is to ramp up notified body capacity. It's not a tap that can be turned on and off. It takes time. So this shows you our IVDR journey at BSI. So BSI came late to the IVDD, and we got designated in 2010, and we got designated with an eye on the IVDR workload. BSI was a big MDD, AIMD organisation, and we wanted to be full scope for everything. So we got designated for the IVDD. Because IVDD was niche, most of the legal manufacturers were already with other notified bodies. So we rumbled along for a while with quite a small portfolio of manufacturers. But we started thinking about hiring for the IVDR in 2014. So January 2014 was our first IVDR product expert hire, and that was me. I was hired because I had some HIV background, so I could do IVDD, but then I've got a lot of cancer and genetic testing background, so I'm fit for IVDR as well. And once I was hired, it was like, any day now, IVDR will be published, any day now. And here we still are. I went away, had a baby, came back, still wasn't published. But in 2017, it was entered into force, and we got designated in the Netherlands in December 2019. And I thought that when it was Christmas Eve, December 19, that we got entered on the Nando database, and I thought, wow, I'm going to go back in after the Christmas holidays and the phone is going to be ringing off the hook. What happened? Nothing happened. No one got in touch. Then the pandemic hit and all of the IVDR manufacturers had something else to think about. But then in June 2020, our IVDR applications really started to ramp up. And that's when we started to see, you know, that expected tsunami of going towards May 2022. We issued our first certificate in December 2020. And then, of course, January 2022, the transition change was published and we renewed all of our IVDD certificates, date of application. We've recently issued our first Class D certificate and our first companion diagnostic certificate. And as of this month, we've issued over 200 certificates and around 3,000 devices, but we're not sure. It's difficult to keep track because manufacturers can extend their scopes. So our average technical documentation review timeline takes about 28 weeks, with a minimum of 3 months and a maximum of over 1 year. At least 50% of that time, the documentation is back with the manufacturer, remedying deficiencies. And that's really conservative. I'd say probably 2/3 of the time it's back with the manufacturer. And that timeline excludes the wait to start because it depends on capacity of specific IVDR codes, which, as Marta said, are a real challenge. And completeness checks also faster because we don't need a technical documentation reviewer to complete that. So for the 25th of May 2025 Class D transition deadline, a manufacturer's first certificate typically takes 12 to 18 months from contract to certificate issue, and the longest timeline is for those manufacturers without experience interacting with notified bodies. Second certificate or second products to go through technical review usually go faster than the first. So I'd recommend getting your first files in with a notified body sooner, take all the learnings into your portfolio and then come with a big bang with everything else. Class D case-by-case risk mitigation activities really add time. You can't train case-by-case. You need experienced reviewers who can follow their gut instinct and understand what the data is telling them. And EU reference lab designation may complicate timelines, certainly in the short term. So if designation happens between now and 2025, depending on what that transition looks like, it could get even more difficult than it is now. So we're accepting IVDR applications. Charlotte and Vicky are in the audience here, so if anyone wants to talk about an application at BSI, they're more than willing to hear. That's me. So any questions?
That's it. Thanks, Liz, for a great presentation. Any questions from the audience? I think we can do maybe one or two quickly. Yes.
Thank you, Liz. I was wondering, because as you said, for the moment, no European reference lab there, so you make a case by case. I was wondering about the predictability of that for the manufacturers, which do not know what will happen with their product when they start a conformity assessment, basically.
Yep.
And secondly, how you will deal, because if one European lab will be designated soon, it means that all the notified body will need to use the same lab. What is this traffic jam? How this will affect, basically, for manufacturer, their conformity assessment process?
Yep. So the second question is easier to answer because the answer is I don't really know. But the notified bodies have escalated that concern to the Commission and to the reference labs that we know have applied. They understand and they recognise it as well. So my gut feel is that the transition is going to be quite long, but we'll see because it's urgently needed from a safety perspective. And in terms of predictability, you're right, it is unpredictable. The majority of blood screening and HIV viral load testing devices are already on the market under the directive, so these manufacturers are used to interacting with notified bodies. So those devices are less of a concern, but I think it would be very unpredictable for the SARS-CoV-2 manufacturers, and the quality of the documentation is highly variable. Thank you.